Hi, and welcome to Civs 101, the show where historians discuss Sid Meier's Civilization series. I'm your host, Bob Whitaker. On today's episode, we'll be looking at the Inca, led in Civilization 6 by Pachacuti. The Inca have been a part of the Civilization series since Civ 3, but they've become an especially compelling Civ in Civilization 6, where they are introduced as part of the environmentally focused Gathering Storm DLC. The Inca Civ offers several unique abilities that allow Gathering Storm players to make the most of surrounding geography and environment. But how closely do these abilities mirror Inca history? And are there any ways in which the depiction of the Inca in this game can be improved? To help me answer these questions, I've invited onto the show Dr. Christopher Heaney. Dr. Heaney is an assistant professor of Latin American history at Penn State University. Dr. Heaney's research interests include the history of the Incas, museums, and the looting and collection of the dead in Peru and the Americas. He is the author of the book Cradle of Gold, which told the story of Hiram Bingham's discovery of Machu Picchu in 1911. Fans of History Respawned will remember Dr. Heaney from our episode on Uncharted 4. Chris, welcome to Civs 101.
Thanks so much, Bob. I'm very happy to be back.
Awesome. Yeah, so Chris, what is your experience with the Civilization series? And also, can you tell us, what do you make of the way that this series presents the past?
I first played Civilization in the back seat of my friend's car on a road trip in Portugal about 10 years ago. I wasn't somebody who grew up on the early iterations of the game. I was more of a SimCity 2000 reticulating spleens kind of guy. But I was, we're doing this road trip in incredible Atlantic countryside, and I just couldn't look out the window because I sucked into the iOS port of the game, which I guess was Civilization Revolutions.
That sounds right. Yeah.
Which is probably pretty stripped down compared to where the console or the sort of the desktop version was at the time. But I loved it, and I think it was the first game I paid money for on iOS, so that I could play as the Aztec, which weren't in my mind as awesome of a choice as the Incas, but did let me do the sort of the route to victory that I loved, which was taking the Aztecs to a scientific domination. Because I loved how their temples could give that science bonus in the late stages. Well, from early on, but in the late stages of the game, create a really cool effect, which I thought was also kind of an interesting way of talking about cosmologies and knowledge as it not just being quote unquote science, but just ways of understanding the world that other understandings of sacred and sacred beings could reflect. And so I had a lot of fun with that, but I hadn't really ever played it on a desktop until you reached out to me, and I sort of checked back in. I downloaded Civ 6, and I'm at about 50 BC in a game with the Incas, and I don't think I'm using them right. But I have converted everyone in Jerusalem and Madrid to my Inca religion that I took that path on, and so I'm feeling pretty good about that.
Excellent. Good work. Yeah, I haven't quite gotten to a religion yet. I'm at 75 BC. Here, and so it's kind of something that's a little disappointing for this playthrough so far, but as you can see, it's kind of in the middle of a continent here, randomly created continent, and we've got a lot of terrace farms going on. We've got a few city-states in the region, and then interestingly, we've got the Congo, another Civ over here, just to the southwest. And I actually haven't played against the Congo that much, or played as the Congo, so I'm really curious as to see where this game goes and to see what kind of relationship emerges here. As you can see so far, they're still pretty friendly, so things are going okay at the moment. We'll see how long that lasts. And then also, I kind of queued this up a little bit. It made sense for the game, but then also thinking about our upcoming discussion, I'm in the process here of building Machu Picchu for the Incas. So I figured that would be worthwhile for this episode. So next question related specifically to the leader of the Inca in this game, and that's Pachacuti. And I'm wondering, what do you make of Pachacuti as a representative figure for the Inca? And furthermore, are there any other potential candidates that you think could make a good leader for this Civ?
Yeah, I think he's the clear and obvious and right choice for a number of reasons. I have some other candidates, but I think having Pachacuti and playing as him also helps me sort of think and create sort of a headcanon, if you will, about what is exactly going on in a civilization game. I didn't answer your earlier question about what I think about it's how it uses civilization in general. And I guess maybe I hinted at it that I take great pleasure at like being the Aztecs or the Incas and trying to run the table on other civilizations because of how they've been represented in the past in world histories as from the 16th century, particularly in the case of the Aztec, as quote unquote savage or sacrificing, and therefore worthy of conquest by Europe, or in the case of the Incas as the stereotype from the 16th century was as noble, but ultimately unable to defend themselves adequately against European religion and technological superiority, supposed technological superiority, which in the 20th century, I think gets resurrected as thinking about germs and again, technology as sort of the things that provide a civilization with the means to sort of conquer other people, not necessarily thrive. And Pachacuti is interesting for me as a way to think about what playing as the Incas does for a game like this. One of the questions I had for you, and you can answer it, but is what exactly we're doing when we choose a historical figure to play as this game. For me, it's always been sort of like a fun extra layer. I was like, oh yeah, if were playing this people, it would make sense to have this leader. But it's not really as if you're Mahatma Gandhi all through human history. I mean, this is a game, obviously. But Pachacuti is an interesting way of thinking through that idea, because he is, there are a number of different counts of how many Inca emperors there were. He was the ninth, according to some counts. I checked out the Civlopedia they have on him, and it's pretty good in saying that he was born Kusi Yupanqui, the son of a Inca emperor named Viracocha. And at some point, he went from a leader of one of Viracocha's army, or a co-ruler, to being the ruler himself when he defended Cusco from an invasion of a neighboring group named the Chanca. And at that point, he shamed his father and took control of the Inca state. And that state was named Tawantinsuyu, or the four parts drawn together. And after Pachacuti, the Incas expanded from their valley in Cusco and this larger area in the southern Andes. And over the course of the next 3 generations, created the largest empire in the Americas, reaching up to Ecuador and down to Chile and Argentina. And there was a work of 3 generations. Kusi Yupanqui, his son Tupa Yupanqui, and then his grandson Huayna Capac, who was the last fully recognized Inca emperor before the Spanish invaded, and his sons Atahualpa and Huascar fought each other. And I think I understood that Huayna Capac was also a possibility in an earlier game.
Yes.
And that's Pachacuti is the better choice because Huayna Capac very famously dies at a crucial moment, right as the Spanish are beginning to invade, and the competitions between his sons is one of the reasons that the empire is vulnerable to the Spanish invasion. They're able to take advantage of rivalries among the Inca houses as well as among their subjects, and position themselves as basically force multipliers for one side against the other, and then essentially through trickery taking over the entire empire. Pachacuti, though, he inaugurates this transformation of a valley-based polity to this massive empire that was an empire like old world empires were empires in terms of their domination of distant people, having a cosmovision that positions the Incas as above everyone, as children of the sun. And because the sun was understood to be everyone's ancestor, they were therefore the ancestors of all of their subjects, which matters for Pachacuti upon his death. Pachacuti, one of the reforms that he introduced to the Incas was the transformation of their mortuary cult. After how he remade Inca religion was after Pachacuti died. When an Inca died, they didn't really die. They were preserved. They were artificially mummified, and understood to be still living and capable of bringing down lightning and rains. And they remained the master and mistresses because it wasn't just an Inca, but an Inca and their consort, the Koya. They became the master and mistresses of their houses, even in death, as well as their estates, which stretched from Cusco to Machu Picchu across the empire. So you had a cohort of what in Spanish eyes were dead emperors, but in the eyes of the Incas were still living, which makes Pachacuti, I think, the perfect civilization leader, because under his ideology and religion, he never dies. He just keeps on going. And it's actually, it conforms with how would you reflect an Inca cosmology in a game like this? You would take seriously that the most powerful Inca emperor would continue to shape the lives of his descendants. In actual history, it wasn't, well, maybe it was Pachacuti. I'm not going to say it wasn't. But his sons, but particularly daughters who were in charge of his cult, would sort of shape the policies of the empire. So I think it's fun to play as Pachacuti and think about that as thinking about a centuries, millennia old embodied consciousness and sort of set of wills emanating from a Inca lord, and using that to sort of project outward and sort of remake the world, which is what Pachacuti's name meant. It meant world changer, world transformer, the person who brings about the revolution. And so for him, it was very much about reaching out from Cusco and extending Inca power and cosmovision across the Andes.
That's fascinating. It's interesting to think that, relating it to Inca cosmology and the thought of mummification and how digital avatars actually fit into surprisingly well into that kind of history. And, to answer your question to me regarding, why do they focus on these central figures? It used to be the case, in Civs 1 through 5, basically, where when you were a player and you were picking your Civ to play, you would pick it based on, what civilization, what nation state you were interested in playing at. And the leader of that group would be kind of a secondary concern. But now with Civilization 6 and all of the new DLC that's come out, they've really focused on the leaders first, and the kind of country of origin or the civilization that they're based out of is kind of a secondary concern. And I think that has to do with their emphasis in terms of building up role-playing mechanics in the game. And so, you made this offhand remark about, people playing as Gandhi and, staying as Gandhi. And their play habits. Well, it could be the case that some of these players do actually kind of build into their thought with this game that they are play acting as these historical figures. And so, at least for some players, particularly those familiar with role-playing games, that kind of play acting is something that can help, I think, draw the player closer to one of these 4X games, one of these big strategy games, which tend to be, on the whole, kind of impersonal. They're not something you really think about having a close personal reaction with, but instead thinking about it in terms of hexes and numbers and different sliders that you can adjust. But I think with Civilization 6, they're kind of thinking of it as in terms of building up your personal narrative with this historical actor that you are taking on the role of throughout this game.
I like that. I think I know this is jumping on one of the questions, but to give a taste of it, I think something that'll be interesting is to think about not just individuals, but couples. That when the Spanish got to Peru, in what they called Peru in the 16th century, their understanding of what a leader was or a monarch was largely defined by male inheritance and primogeniture. And so they were the ones who were concerned with creating king lists and sort of figuring out, okay, who are the important kings. And Pachacuti wasn't just Pachacuti. Pachacuti, in order to become the Inca and have this leadership, had to find a consort, another equally kapak, a royal or worthy member of his family, and his was Koya Anahuac. Later, empresses were even more powerful than her. His daughter-in-law, Mama Okyo, ruled the Inca Empire, while her son, Huayna Capac, was too young to take on the role. And so it'd be interesting to think about how it's not just singular individuals, but sort of the complementary relationships that particular cultures have that we get us away from like literally the great men. And I know that Elizabeth is here as well, but sort of the families or sort of combinations of people that also were what created power. In the case of the Incas, it's what Pachacuti was off dominating, his consort would be at home, essentially ruling the capital and the religious organization of the Incas.
Well, that leads us into the next question really well, which is this idea of civilization. And, this game is built on this notion of civilization, which, as a historical construct, harkens back to a different era of historical study, one dominated by the West and, built around largely arbitrarily constructed groups of people, usually living in the Western world in the ancient era. And so, given the nature of civilization as an idea, what do you make of this game's depiction of the Inca civilization? And do you feel that the Inca Civ gives players a real sense of Inca history, or do you think the term civilization does a disservice to our perception of that history?
I think, civilization, has this very problematic past, and how it was used, especially in the 18th, 19th century, to essentially sort between those civilizations that could be included under the quote unquote the West, or could be opposed as the East or the Orient. And especially when it comes to native peoples in the 19th century, was used as sort of a cudgel by anthropologists and others to say that people in Africa or in the Americas didn't have civilization. What's interesting, great, Machu Picchu is being made.
It is, yeah.
There's the one. Not the one. That kind of plays into the point of the Incas were kind of, from the 16th century, used as an exception by Europeans, in a way that both recognized that when the Spanish got to Cusco, they were awestruck at what they saw as a city as ordered and laid out and wealthy and literally palatial as those of Europe, and perhaps even more so than most places that these conquistadors were coming from in Europe. And that in the 16th century was part of the critique that critics of Spanish Empire made of their expansions, like that the Spanish toppled an empire as perfect as any in Europe. Now, what's loaded in that judgment, that this idea that starts from the 16th century that the Incas were civilized, is that other native peoples weren't, and that the Incas were either an exception that proved the rule, or something that existed in the past. That after they were supposedly conquered, and I say supposedly because the Incas survived as a people through the 19th century under the Spanish, and then their heirs living today in Spain and in Peru. But the idea being that their greatness was a thing of the past. And so I think, the civilization does get used to beat on people and sort of judge them as, do they check the boxes of what Europeans were expecting to find or respect. All that said, it was really cool to see how they'd brought Pachacuti's biography in, and there's things that I would add, like the duality of marriage and what that meant for Inca rule and things like that, and the thing that I think a lot about is knowledges of the dead and religion and things that get very specific. But in general, that biography is pretty good. It sort of it holds up. The Kapaknyan function is, I think, a great addition. I mean, how great is it to not be to turn the roads into the mountains into roads? I would say for the developers, not to step on another question.
Go for it.
That the Incas would have not just built the roads, but had them pretty well defended too. It would, they could make them. It does make civilization, or I just did it myself, of people vulnerable to have roads that enter it from just about anywhere. But I think the Incas did a very good job of controlling movement along them. I think I didn't get so far as to get to play as the Huaracac, but that seems a pretty interesting sort of incorporation of Inca military prowess as an advantage that sort of tips the usual way that they're viewed in the Jared Diamond guns, germs, and steel sense as their technology not being superior. I think what we know about technology is that it's cultural, that the way you use it is important, and that in particular settings, one technology is more apt than another. And I think having them is interesting. I wasn't able to build Machu Picchu myself, so I don't know what it does for the Incas. But it was a royal estate of Pachacuti that he built as he expanded towards the jungle. And does it do anything special for?
Yeah, so it's got the description here. Mountain tiles provide a standard adjacency bonus to commercial hub, theater space, theater square, industrial zone districts in all cities. So this is kind of a powerful improvement that you can use to kind of add on points to the money that you're bringing in through the commercial hubs, the culture that you're bringing in through theater squares, and then the production that you are bringing in through industrial zones. And of course, it is very closely tied to mountain tiles, which I think make the Inca a really interesting inclusion in Civilization 6, and particularly with the Gathering Storm DLC, which, post-release DLC downloadable content that came out a couple years ago. And it really closely ties the Inca into the natural environment where you start. And so if you happen to start in a mountainous region, like the one we've got here, you've got all sorts of potential advantages that you can take advantage of based off of natural environment, which, in past Civilization games, it was very often the case that mountain regions in particular were kind of wasted space. But I think here, with the way that they've incorporated the Inca, it's a way to enliven the gameplay for players, but then also to kind of build upon the idea that, we don't have to conceive of mountain regions, of these terrains, as just spaces for Western civilizations. Instead, we can also conceive of them in different ways using different civs. So I think, for me personally, playing as the Incas, it's one of my favorite things to do in this DLC, because it really ties you into the narrative they're presenting about the importance of environmental history, but then also the potential for non-traditional civs, like non-England or France or Germany, all these classic nation states that are used as civs, incorporating them as powerful players in the game.
Yeah, I like that. And I like that, as you carry it forward, it lets you think in I think a way that's very useful about what indigenous societies continue to give and gave, and to world history. And I think it's important to flag that indigenous peoples in Peru, in Bolivia, continue to struggle with the state and how they've been marginalized, but also that they are the inheritors of millennia-long traditions of using mountains and altitudes to experiment with different food sources. We have all the varieties of potatoes that we have, and there are a lot of varieties, even though you can only buy a few in American stores, because of their experiments with agricultural and botanical crossing of strains, different altitudes over millennia. Mm-hmm. And that's, potatoes being one of those crops that feeds the world. And their contributions and use of mountain environments to develop medicaments like anti-malarials like cinchona, which we know we mostly run across today as the tonic in gin and tonics, but that has the cinchona bark that was first crafted by former subjects of the Incas in the 17th, 18th century to respond to malaria coming from the old world. That's an Andean contribution. And I think anything that sort of gets people to think about the strengths of a society that aren't, can they get ships out into the ocean as fast as possible, mm-hmm. Is pretty wonderful. One thing I did want to point to as a missed opportunity, but I think it's probably a missed opportunity that's true of the entire game system, is the mita, and that's the working of mountains. And I think it's great in an agricultural sense and a production sense, but what is also hiding in there is what exactly labor is in this game. Here it's in history, the mita was a turn labor, a turn at labor that every male community member had to do for the empire. And it was based in some Andean ideas of mutual obligation and reciprocity, but it was definitely top down when it came to the Inca, and it edged into this empire's ability to move people around and make them permanent workers, or yanaconas, which the Incas did not have slaves in the categorical sense that Europe did, but they did have people who were bound to the state and did not have they didn't have chattel slavery is what I'm trying to say, but they did have essentially captive and dependent peoples, which is something that, if there's one spot that I think the Civ games really, leave off the table, because it would be pretty upsetting to play as. I understand why they do it, is that, this vision of civilizational advance and technological advance in human history is doesn't really look directly at how much of that development, particularly in Europe, for example, was based on the captive bodies of others. And I don't think that is something to include in the game, but I think in terms of how what is history here and what isn't, that's one of the things that's not history, that's left off the table.
Yeah.
Again, for good reason.
Yeah.
What is this here?
Yeah, so there is a benefit that comes on later in the game, the triangular trade, and it does make some mention here of the transatlantic slave trade, but just in an indirect sense, and you only get a real look at this if you bother to go into the Civlopedia. So it's not something that's kind of put forward in front of the player, right, to look at. You have to go around digging in the Civlopedia for it. But this is kind of one of the few instances in this game where that kind of subject matter is brought up, but it's not necessarily brought up in a way that I think really directly deals with it in a way that you would really want as a historian. And, this kind of follows through with the long-term depiction of slavery by civilization. Sid Meier talks a whole bunch about how, they were trying to use this game and use for the game history that you would find in like a children's library. It's not kind of designed to be the kind of really hard-hitting history that you would get later on in grade school or in college, obviously. And so on the one hand, that makes the game approachable to players because they feel like this kind of children's library version of the past is one that they can easily grapple with and master and know. So it kind of strokes their ego. But at the same time, it leaves a lot of these kind of uncomfortable gaps in the history, like you said. And, this is just kind of one instance here of that kind of uncomfortable history briefly being mentioned. But it's not something that, would really fly in most college classes, for instance. So it is something I think, it's very worthwhile to keep in mind. And also to keep in mind, because this is something, this benefit just briefly comes after you get mercantilism. So it comes kind of mid to late point in the game, but it kind of ignores the subject matter you're talking about up to that point. What's going on in the ancient era, what's going on in the classical era, all of these different eras leading up to this point. It's like when you get to mercantilism in the Renaissance and later, it's like, oh, here it is, but what happens before that? I think that's a really great point.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that does it for my questions. Anything else? Any other recommendations you might have regarding the game or the Incas in specifics?
I think I'd recommend to your listeners. There's some great books out there. There's a slightly older one by a Peruvian historian named Maria Rosworowski, Diaz Canseco, The History of the Inca Realm, which is she's since passed away, but gives a really good sense of like what is different about Inca statecraft and complementarity and co-rulers and how exactly the Incas expanded, not just through military prowess, but by sort of making relationships. And another great one, Alan Covey's The Inca Apocalypse, just came out last year, I believe. And looking at the Spanish invasion of Peru, and taking both sides' cosmologies seriously, what it meant to think apocalyptically about that moment, because not just in the sense of things ending, but that things were being revealed too. And so the great reads. And I think if there's some developers of Civ listening to this, I think it'd be really interesting to talk about what different understandings of the sacred do. I know there are events in the game new to this expansion. It seems like of flooding, and I think that's a really cool inclusion. I think and it gives some space to think about how particular civilizations also would take advantage cosmically of like what it said that their civilization was able to master a flood rather than not. Or in the case of one of the great stories from Pachacuti, is that the stones around Cusco came to life to defend Cusco from the Chancas when they were attacking. And I know that gets into tricky territory when you start giving specific faiths and sacralities and religions sort of powers in game. But it's cool.
It does sound cool.
In this case, I would love to see Machu Picchu turn into a mech.
Well, we kind of have the start of a mech here. I feel like this could be the head right here at the top, and then maybe eyes here for the window slits, and then arms made of tiny terraces, perhaps. That would be awesome, and then it could fight this volcano over here.
Yeah. Well, anything, I think as it's a pleasure to see how they've incorporated Inca history so far as they have, and that means that the door is forever opening. So it'll be fun to watch them develop it in the future, and go Peru.
All right. Well, on that note, that ends this episode of Civs 101. Chris, thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome, Bob. Thanks for having me.